Welcome to The Debate, where we engage in a respectful, intellectual exchange on the substantive issues shaping our world. Today we're diving into a really critical issue facing the United States, the vanishing middle class and the widening gap between the rich and the poor.
That's right. And our discussion today emerges from Peter Temin's, quite seminal work, The Vanishing Middle Class: Prejudice and Power in a Dual Economy. It's a book that powerfully argues the American economy has fundamentally transformed into what he calls a dual economy.
Exactly. And this system, it doesn't really resemble a leading industrial nation anymore. It operates more like historical development models, characterized by a highly prosperous FTE, that's finance, technology, and electronics sector on one hand, and a struggling low-wage sector on the other.
Leading to that stark two-humped camel distribution of income Temin illustrates so effectively. It's a powerful image.
It really is. So, our central question today, drawing deeply from Temin's overarching arguments throughout the book, is this. Is the persistence of this American dual economy primarily driven by fundamental economic and technological shifts? Or is it driven by deeply embedded political decisions and historical legacies, particularly what Temin describes as racecraft and the investment theory of politics? I'll be arguing that it's these specific political decisions and deep-seated historical factors that are really the primary architects and, frankly, the perpetuators of this division.
And I'll be coming at it from a different angle. I'll present the perspective that the dual economy is fundamentally a result of profound, large-scale economic and technological transformations. And our political systems have quite often simply failed to adequately respond to these powerful currents.
Okay, so let's kick this off then. My view, drawing directly from Temin's analysis, is that this dual economy in the U.S. isn't just some accidental economic outcome, a natural evolution of markets. Instead, I think it's a deliberate and actively maintained structure. The FTE sector, operating from a position of pretty clear self-interest, wields significant political power and leverages historical legacies, especially what Temin terms racecraft, to ensure the continued subjugation, and the low-wage sector. It's a sobering system where, as the book quite bluntly puts it, the rich of the 21st century are trying to kill the goose that laid all those golden eggs in the 20th century. And the evidence Temin lays out for this is, it's incredibly compelling. He doesn't just adapt the classic Lewis model. He fundamentally reframes it for the U.S. context. The original Lewis model, it describes a developing economy, where a modern industrial sector draws surplus labor from a subsistence agricultural sector. But Temin's adaptation explicitly states that the upper sector wants to keep wages low in the lower sector. This isn't a passive economic process. It's an active political desire. And we see this manifested in a series of, calculated political strategies, starting with Nixon's Southern strategy and the subsequent war on drugs, initiated back in 1971. The book details how Nixon quite explicitly linked class and race interests, appealing to racial anxieties to essentially fracture potential cross-racial class solidarity. The war on drugs then becomes, as Temin argues, a kind of new Jim Crow, disproportionately targeting African Americans. We're talking about staggering statistics, like 1 in 3 black men expected to go to jail. This eroded communities, gutted social capital, and created mass incarceration as just a brutal form of social control. And crucially, this policy diverted vital funds from urban areas, often predominantly black and low income, to rural prisons, further marginalizing the low-wage sector and cementing its disadvantages. Okay, then there's the Powell Medal, also from 1971, a literal call to arms for corporate America. This galvanized aggressive political lobbying and the foundational support for conservative think tanks like Cato and Heritage and organizations like ALEC. These entities, funded heavily by FTE sector interests, actively drafted model legislation aimed squarely at reducing business regulation, privatizing public services, cutting taxes for the wealthy, and restricting unions. All measures that directly and devastatingly impact the low-wage sector. It's a clear illustration of the FTE sector using political power to shape economic outcomes to its benefit. And finally, we see it in judicial decisions. Supreme Court cases like Milliken v. Bradley in '74, which effectively sanctioned segregated urban schools by requiring proof of discriminatory intent rather than just looking at the discriminatory effect. That locked in disadvantages for generations of low-wage sector children, limiting their human capital development, perpetuating the skills gap. Or, more recently, Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, leading to what Temin calls a spate of new voting restrictions that disproportionately affect poor whites and blacks, weakening the political voice of the entire low-wage sector. These aren't economic inevitabilities. They demonstrably show how political and judicial systems are actively engaged in upholding this dual economy, ensuring its longevity.
I can certainly appreciate the powerful narrative you've laid out there, especially concerning the role of political agency and, yes, historical injustices. It's hard to ignore. However, my argument is that while these factors are undeniably significant in, let's say, mediating and certainly exacerbating the situation, the primary driver, the fundamental structure of the American dual economy, it's rooted in profound global economic and technological transformations that really took hold in the latter half of the 20th century. From this perspective, political policies often respond inadequately, sometimes badly, to these shifts, or their failures create vulnerabilities rather than being the initial cause or the architect of the dual economic structure itself. And Temin's own material, in fact, provides strong support for this perspective. He highlights, and I quote, that factory jobs have been disappearing for a generation. That is the main driver of the declining line in Figure 1. This points directly to deindustrialization, a massive technological shift, yes, but also coupled with globalization, the rise of Japanese and Chinese imports, the increasing ease of American firms expanding offshore. These aren't political machinations in their inception. They are fundamental economic currents that drastically reduce demand for semi-skilled labor and consequently stagnated wages for the median worker since the 1970s. Moreover, technological automation, particularly with the widespread adoption of computers, drastically reduced demand for routine tasks. This process segmented jobs into well-paid, often professional activities within the FTE sector and poorly paid, often manual service jobs in the low-wage sector. This hollowing out of the wage distribution, as economists call it, structurally reduced middle-class employment. That's an economic reality, irrespective of specific political intent at the start.
Okay, but the response to that hollowing matters.
Exactly. The response matters, but the initial pressure is economic. And consider financialization. While its excesses are, they're well documented and debated, its initial emergence was, in many ways, an economic imperative. The tumultuous 1970s, with volatile price and exchange rate gyrations after the end of Bretton Woods, created a great need for financial help, as Temin puts it, to reallocate resources between industries efficiently. Deregulation, while highly controversial and often leading to problems down the line, was initially argued as necessary for finance to manage this huge economic transformation. The increasing human capital required in a highly complex and globalized finance sector naturally led to higher incomes in that sector, explaining much of its growth and compensation, rather than it solely being political machinations designed to benefit a specific elite. Furthermore, we see these formidable barriers to mobility through education. Temin acknowledges the link between the two sectors as education, but he says it is difficult, however, and strewn with obstacles. Why? Because of the high cost of education and the crushing burden of student loan debt, now the second largest consumer debt. These are fundamentally economic barriers, consequences of declining public support for higher education and the rise of for-profit colleges. They affect all aspiring individuals trying to move up, regardless of specific racial intent, although the impact might be felt differently. Lastly, the theory of international trade itself, while promising overall benefits for nations, always has uneven effects in each country. There are winners and losers. Temin notes this. The failure to compensate low-wage workers for losses due to increased trade signals a profound economic problem, exacerbated by policy inaction perhaps, but not necessarily malicious intent from the outset, to create a dual economy.
Inaction can be a form of action, though, can it? A choice?
It can be, yes. But is it the primary driver? So from my vantage point, the initial and ongoing division of the economy into these two sectors is fundamentally driven by these undeniable large-scale economic forces. Temin's figure 4, showing the decline of middle-wage jobs, or the impact of globalization, reducing manufacturing employment, these point to a fundamental restructuring of how our economy actually works. When Temin himself adapts the Lewis model, remember its original application was to developing countries, depicting an economy with surplus labor in a subsistence sector feeding into a modern industrial sector. The U.S. has, somewhat ironically, deindustrialized to such an extent that its economy has become, in some ways, more like a developing one in its labor market dynamics. These are forces that occur in many ways irrespective of specific political will. They're like tectonic plates shifting under the economy.
I see why you emphasize those economic shifts. They're certainly powerful. They are undeniable. But let me offer a slightly different perspective on Temin's core argument, particularly his use of the Lewis model. He makes it very clear that the application of the Lewis model to the U.S. is an adaptation that specifically highlights how the upper sector wants to keep wages low in the lower sector. This isn't just about economic forces creating a natural surplus of labor, like in the original model for developing nations. It's about an active, conscious desire and intent on the part of the powerful FT sector to maintain that surplus and actively depress wages. The deindustrialization you rightly mentioned was certainly a factor, a huge factor, but it was profoundly compounded by specific political decisions. Policies that allowed American firms to readily use offshore production as a bargaining chip against domestic workers, for example, that directly contributed to declining union power and stagnant wages. This wasn't merely a passive response to economic shifts, it was a political choice that amplified and directed those shifts to serve a particular agenda. The intent to depress wages is absolutely central to Temin's adaptation of the model, transforming it from, just a descriptive economic theory into a pretty sharp critical commentary on power.
The intent aspect is definitely provocative.
It is, and your point on the scale of economic forces is well taken. But even within those shifts, we see how deliberately racecraft is deployed. The persistent use of it isn't just a byproduct or some unfortunate side effect, it's a very intentional political tool, as Temin argues quite forcefully. The book compellingly states, and I'll quote again, "Racism becomes a tool for the rich to arouse poor whites to feel superior to blacks and distract them from their economic plight." This isn't subtle stuff. It's evident in the coded language used by politicians, really since the civil rights movement, talking about welfare queens or inner-city crime, and it's reflected in the vastly disproportionate enforcement of the war on drugs against black communities and the systemic neglect of urban schools compared to suburban ones. The Flint water crisis, for instance, where FTE sector representatives essentially prioritized lower taxes and short-term cost savings over basic essential services for low-wage, predominantly black residents, it just vividly illustrates this active disregard. It's not just a consequence of economic vulnerability, it's deployed as a mechanism of control designed specifically to keep segments of the low-wage sector fractured, fighting amongst themselves, and ultimately disempowered.
I can absolutely see why you emphasize that. It's a powerful and frankly disturbing narrative, and there's undeniable truth to the racial dynamics. Yet, when I look at Temin's data, particularly around the broader impact on, say, white working-class communities in Appalachia or the Rust Belt, I find myself asking, isn't this perhaps more about economic vulnerability that is magnified and directed by race rather than race being the sole architectural blueprint for the dual economy itself? The book explicitly notes, and this is a crucial line, that the American dual economy would exist if there were no American blacks.
That's a stark statement, yes.
Is. And think about white flight. It didn't just leave black communities isolated. It also left poor whites in inner cities or declining rural areas facing very similar economic and social pressures, rising incarceration rates, declining social capital, lack of opportunity. The broader problem of, casualized work, precarious employment, reduced public investment, failing infrastructure, these often impact all members of the low-wage sector regardless of race. Race undoubtedly intensifies and directs the adverse effects of policy towards specific communities, making their suffering acutely worse, absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily mean race is the primary driver of the fundamental economic structure itself. It functions more like a potent multiplier and tragically an allocator of disadvantage within an already vulnerable economic structure created by those larger shifts.
A multiplier, perhaps, but one consciously applied for political gain, wouldn't you say?
That's where our core disagreement lies, I suppose. Now, moving to financialization, I think we do have to acknowledge the genuine economic rationale behind its initial growth. The rapid expansion and, yes, the high returns in the finance sector were in large part a natural economic development. They were a response to the massive need for capital reallocation after the end of Bretton Woods and the subsequent volatility. The global economy became far more complex, far more volatile, requiring sophisticated financial instruments and expertise to manage risk and allocate investment effectively. More educated people with high human capital, were naturally attracted to finance because of these increasing needs, and this explains much of the rise in financial incomes. This suggests a powerful economic dynamic driving the sector's growth and its compensation, rather than it being purely a political construct actively maintained simply to enrich a powerful few. The market was, at least initially, responding to a genuine need for financial intermediation in a newly complex and risky global economy.
I have to come at that from a different way entirely. While there might be some underlying economic logic, Temin's investment theory of politics directly challenges this notion of finance being a purely natural, economically driven development. This theory, I think, is foundational to understanding the political shaping of our economy. It states, quite plainly, that the effects of voting are determined by entities, businesses, rich individuals, PACs, that are able to make large investments in political contests. This is an abstract theory. Temin shows how the top 1% of the 1%, largely drawn from this FTE sector, contributes over a quarter of all political contributions. Their preferences for lower taxes, for reduced business regulation, for diminished social welfare programs, well, they directly influence policy outcomes. This, for example, is why banks were swiftly bailed out in 2008 while homeowners were largely left to flounder, despite, clear legal provisions for mortgage relief within TARP itself. It's a very active shaping of economic outcomes through political investment, ensuring the FTE sector's dominance and preferences prevail. It allows this powerful sector to effectively dictate which economic needs are prioritized, whose risks are socialized, and ultimately how resources are distributed. This solidifies the dual economy through explicit political will and action, not just impersonal market forces. And that, I believe, is what Temin's overarching argument really points to, a system that might look accidental on the surface, but is in fact highly intentional in its design and maintenance.
Intentionality is a strong claim for such complex systems.
But one I think the evidence supports. So, to reiterate my position, while economic and technological changes are undoubtedly powerful, they set the stage, yes, but the specific form, the remarkable persistence, and the increasing severity of the American dual economy are fundamentally a consequence of deliberate political choices and these deeply ingrained historical legacies, particularly race. The powerful FTE sector, through mechanisms like the investment theory of politics and the cynical manipulation of racecraft, actively designs and perpetuates policies that maintain low wages and reduce social capital in the low-wage sector, often sacrificing broader societal well-being for private gain. This active political struggle, where power is wielded explicitly to shape markets, is what freezes the dual economy in place, making genuine, equitable change incredibly difficult, without a fundamental restructuring of those power dynamics.
And from my perspective, to summarize, the real bedrock of this shift to a dual economy lies in these massive economic and technological currents. Forces like automation, the almost inexorable pull of deindustrialization, and the rise of a highly specialized, capital-intensive FTE sector, all occurring within a rapidly globalizing world. While political action and historical factors like race certainly mediate, direct, and yes, exacerbate these trends, they often represent, in my view, a failure to adapt to or an inadequate, sometimes flawed response to these underlying economic transformations. The challenge then isn't merely one of political will, though that's part of it, but how to effectively manage and guide these profound, often global economic shifts for the benefit of all citizens, without letting huge segments fall permanently behind due to market forces that are frankly very difficult for any single government to fully control.
Ultimately, understanding this complex interplay, where the overarching arguments throughout Temin's work reveal this constant, dynamic tension between powerful economic forces and deliberate political agency, is absolutely essential for anyone seeking to grasp the full implications of America's vanishing middle class. It really compels us to ask difficult questions about causation, about responsibility, and importantly, about the path forward.
Indeed, and we encourage our listeners to explore Peter Temin's The Vanishing Middle Class, Prejudice and Power in a Dual Economy, to delve deeper into these nuanced perspectives and form their own informed conclusions on this critical issue.